Stanford University.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. As we were saying earlier, I award everyone a classes without quiz bonus point for being awake, here, dressed, and moderately ready to think about topics. When I teach classes to undergraduates, I don't know, I've never taught one at 8 o'clock in the morning. When I teach classes that start at, say, 1, I'm still suspect about how much change has taken place from the bed area to the classroom area, and I suspect that it is not a lot. So I so appreciate you being here this morning. I look forward to every opportunity to talk about the topic of adolescent literacy and literature, which is an area of my research and passion and interest. Today is a class without quiz, so you should feel free to wander around, use the restroom at will, no passes required. Beverages are downstairs, come and go, whatever makes you feel comfortable. I'm saying all this as a preview because even though this is called a class without quiz, I thought we might start with a quiz this morning. You won't be graded and you can cheat. Let me tell you first a little bit about why I'm interested in this topic and some of the things that I do here at Stanford. And then let's look at an agenda for today. I think my nifty remote works. Oh, it worked too well. Here we go. As Caroline so nicely told you, I'm a senior lecturer in the Graduate School of Education, where I am also the director of the Undergraduate Minor in Education. As some of you probably know, we don't have an undergraduate major in education. The way credentialing works in the state of California, we like to see people come to a teacher credential program with a bachelor's degree in something. So the study of education has been designated as a graduate area of study. At the same time, we have an entire group of really intelligent, talented, committed, and wonderful undergraduates who are thinking in some part of their mind about entering the world of education, either as a teacher or as a researcher or as a person who's interested in policy or other aspects of education. So the minor in education exists to reach out to those undergraduates and say, hey, think about this as you move forward. How can studies in education complement your major area of study? So it's my great pleasure to work with undergraduates who are beginning to discover and articulate out loud their thoughts about working in the field of education. My own interest in education comes from teaching high school English for quite a long period of time and wondering about how it is that teenagers read. Folks who are teaching the very young students, our first graders, our second graders, our third graders, get a lot of instruction in how to teach reading. And we kind of assume that by the time teenagers get to us in middle school or high school, they already know how to read. But there are all new ways of learning to read. We continue to learn to read as we grow older and more experienced in the world. We change our reading habits. We change our reading patterns and the ways that we read. So we're really now looking at teaching reading across the lifespan of the reader. And that's why I'm interested in the way that teenagers read. Here's what we're going to do today as I keep my eye on the clock and leave time for us to talk about books at the end if that's what you're interested in. So we're going to start with the quiz, super low risk, low level, as we try and figure out what is young adult literature, which is my way of looking at how teenagers read. It's not the only way they read, but it's a really interesting way. And then we'll talk about some of the reasons that adults don't like YA, and maybe a few of the reasons why we might consider liking it if we're put to the test. And then I'm interested to look today at the development of how we have looked at adolescent development over time and to parallel that with how we have developed books and literature for young adults over time. And I think you'll be interested to see with me that the new ways of thinking that we've developed about how the adolescent brain, body, and mind work have paralleled the kinds of books and reading that we've had available for young readers and the things that are pleasurable for them to read. And then we'll talk about where does YA exist at Stanford University? What kind of research are we doing around teenagers reading and young adult literacy and literature? And then if we have time left over, we'll talk about some really good books to read. Okay? I'm sorry that I don't know your names. I can see some of you have Yeah, there's no way to stick it on your forehead. That would be uncomfortable and inappropriate. But feel free to ask a question, and if I can't read your name tag, I'll just generously point in your direction. Okay? Ready for a quiz? For this quiz, you'll be working with someone sitting next to you. Don't worry yet. I'll give you more. I'm just paving the way for what's going to happen. The first thing for us to figure out or talk about is what is young adult literature, referred to as YA. It's abbreviation. A lot of people aren't even really clear on what it is, and for a long time I wasn't super clear either, and I think sometimes I still revert in my clarity on it. In the very beginning, we had novels. Novels were written and told for readers, and there was no age limit on that was ever specified by the person who told the tale or the people who were interested in it. A lot of people consider The Life and Death of King Arthur, Mort d'Arthur, to be the first novel. There's lots of fun debate around that. I just put it up as an example of some very early sustained pieces of reading that had a central character and some kind of problem to resolve. Then, leaping ahead hundreds and hundreds of years, people thought, maybe one thing we should have is literature just for children. They're smaller than adults. Their brains work differently. They could use some help in learning how to read, as opposed to our earlier thoughts, which is you're just around someone who reads and you'll sort of naturally pick it up. So what I have in the middle here is a hornbook. Now that was our first ever textbook designed for young readers. It was pretty minimal. It was on a kind of a wooden paddle, which today I think that if we said we're going to give every 5- and 6-year-old a wooden paddle to carry with them through school, we might rethink that idea. But it was small enough and comfortable enough that they could hold it in their hand, and usually it had on it the alphabet. And maybe it would have the numbers. It might have a very brief Bible verse that was in some way related to children, and if you were super lucky, it might have a piece of illustration, because we thought that maybe one way to encourage and pull young people into reading would be a picture to keep their interest. And obviously children's literature developed quite a bit from the hornbook, and then if you keep jumping forward all the way to 1967, you get what some people consider to be the first young adult novel, written by a teenager, about teenagers, and for teenagers. So S.E. Hinton, whose real name was Susan, but they gave her the initials so that boys might like to read her book, wrote The Outsiders when she was 16 years old, and she wrote it about a group of teenage boys that you may or may not consider a gang, depending on how you feel about that word. And it was a fairly brief novel that had some juicy material in it. There was violence, there was some drug use, there was some difficulty, and there were very absent parents. Their parents in this case had died, and so there were teenagers on their own trying to figure out the world. So that's this movement from literature for adults to literature for children to literature for young adults. So here's what you need for your quiz. Would you please first oblige me by looking to someone who's sitting near you and just saying good morning and your name? Everyone needs a partner. Who needs a partner? You're good. She's like, I don't need a partner. Okay. That was very obliging of you to do, and I appreciate it. I'm going to show you 3 opening passages from novels. And I'd like for each one, you and your partner to have a discussion about whether you think it is from a book that was written for an adult, whether you think it's a chapter book that was written for children, youth, under the ages of, let's say, 11 or 10, or whether you think it's from a novel that was written specifically for teenagers. Make sense? Okay. When you talk about it, I'd love for you with your partner to talk about what is it in that opening passage that makes you think that this was written for an adult, for a child, or a teen. All right? First one. Here we go. Nice deep breath. Sam Weinberg in the School of Education, who's done some wonderful research about what makes for good slides or not good slides in a PowerPoint presentation, says never to put up a slide that you don't read. So here you go. The book reads as follows. Chapter 1. In which we meet our hero, and the hero meets an orphan of the storm, and comes face to face with Mr. Charlie, a gentleman known as a bit of a scribbler. So that's a little epigram that's provided, and then you jump into the first paragraph. I apologize for this first paragraph so early in the morning. The rain poured down on London so hard it seemed that it was dancing spray, every raindrop contending with its fellows for supremacy in the air and waiting to splash down. It was a deluge. The drains and sewers were overflowing, throwing up, regurgitating, as it were, the debris of muck, slime, and filth, the dead dogs, the dead rats, cats, and worse. That's the part I apologize for. Would you and your partner please take a minute or two to decide for which audience do you think this was written and why do you think that? You will in no way be graded. Let me give you 2 minutes to talk about it. Thank you. So, show of hands. Written for an adult audience. What do you think? I'm seeing some, some halfway hand, whatever. Okay, written for a child audience. Thank you. Are the remaining people going to raise their hands for written for a teenage audience? People who believe it's written for a teenage audience. I'd be interested to know what is one thing from this passage that kind of screams out teenager to you. Anyone want to say? Yes, please.
Repeated adjective of muck, slime, filth.
And teenagers are dirty?
No, but they, at least I have a teenage boy, and they kind of are thinking of the gross,
Okay.
the dead, the gross, that.
Dead, gross, dirty stuff. Other things that you saw in this passage that made you think it might be written for a teenager? Yes, please.
The thing that struck me was the opening reads like it's for kids, and the body reads like it's for adults, to me.
So you combine the two?
I combined the two.
Well, that's some clever analysis. I like it. Yes, and that first part is a curiosity, isn't it? I'm interested in the people who thought this might be something written for children. Would someone tell me one reason that that leapt out to them from this particular piece? Yes.
For me, it was the tone. I was really torn between, to me, it's perfect for a 12-year-old, and it never falls into a good category.
Right. So what are we supposed to do with a 12-year-old?
The tone and the grossness is real good for 11 and 12-year-olds, too.
Okay. I see that people did not think the tone and the grossness was appropriate for adults.
No, we
Or
thought,
girls.
we thought for adults that it didn't start with a juicy enough beginning sentence. We thought that.
We don't think that that opening passage would call out to an adult.
Correct.
Yeah, in the back.
No,
I
I
thought
thought
that
it
it
would.
was, the descriptions the descriptions are wonderful. I may not agree with them or like them,
Right.
but there also seems to be a theme of, I'm not sure of hierarchy, and
Hmm.
which I don't particularly care for in our current culture.
Do you think teenagers are interested in that?
They're certainly exposed to it. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. So this is one way to define or describe a genre, is to read lots of examples of it and ask yourself, or read lots of examples and ask yourself, does this fit into my category or does this not fit into my category, and why? So in listening to your fabulous, I could stay on this passage probably the whole time listening to these ideas, I'm pulling out things that we think would either make a YA novel or not make a YA novel. I told you this would be a low-risk quiz, but there are 2 more items. Let's go through those and then look over the landscape, okay? Chapter 1, The Transit of Venus. I was raised in a gaunt house with a garden. My earliest recollections are of floating lights in the apple trees. All of the punctuation is as exactly copied from the text itself. I recall in the orchard behind the house orbs of flame. Rising through the black boughs and branches, they climbed, spiritus, and flickered out. My mother squeezed my hand in delight. We stood near the door of the ice chamber. By the well, servants lit bubbles of gas on fire, clad in frock coats of asbestos. How doth all that seeks to rise burn itself to nothing? Have at it with your partner. Child, adult, teenager, why? Sorry, I did bring in some kind of heavy passages for first thing in the morning. Good morning. I'm going to cut you off right there. Sorry to have to do that. But I am interested to hear as much for whom you think this is intended as why you think that. So, anyone for children's literature? Although I have to say that, oh, yes, please tell us.
Well, I'm just kind of stuck on the reference to my mother squeezed my hand into life.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think
Yep.
we were talking about how it's from certainly the perspective of a young child, but I'm thinking about, then we discussed whether it's meant to read to a young child.
This is a great question. And children's literature exists in this really interesting realm where it needs to appeal to the child because that's its intended audience, but it also needs to appeal to the adult because in a lot of cases, the child is dependent on the adult to either get the book or make the book accessible to the child. So children's literature is very sophisticated in its requirement that it appeal to two different generations all in one sitting. And there is that curious passage of a child and his mother looking at some kind of rising flames in the night. That could be a children's story. I mean, back in the day, we considered things like Pilgrim's Progress children's literature because that's all we had. So there's that. Anyone for this being a YA, from a YA novel, a novel for adolescents? Stephanie.
We were trying to remember that whole series of the vampire. What were the
Twilight ones?
Yeah. For some reason, as I'm reading that, I didn't even read them, but the word gaunt and just the spiritus, and then the last how doth all that seems to me like was sort of gothic.
It does seem to have a gothic feel and taste to it, and it is true that in the last 5 to 10 years, teenagers have had some kind of strong appetite for vampire tales, for vamp stories. If you think about it, I think that vampirism is a great metaphor for adolescence. Like your body is changing, you get all these parts you hadn't bargained for, you have a hard time waking up, there are a lot of aspects of the vampire myth that are nicely aligned with adolescence, and I think it gets offered to them through young adult literature as a way to consider their own experience. Anyone want to offer up 1, 2, or 3 things that they thought designated this as adult literature, since very few people raised their hands in the other 2 categories? Something that really seemed adult to you or intended for adults?
It's awfully thought-provoking. Floating lights in the apple trees. Why are lights floating in the apple trees? By the well, servants lit bubbles of gas on fire clad in frock coats and asbestos. What are frock coats and asbestos?
Right, and I don't think we should wear one. Based on what we know today about asbestos, it doesn't sound like a good idea. It seems old. It is evoking images that are not part of our everyday life, so you really need to do some imaginative heavy lifting to get yourself from the place that your own life is to the place where the novel is. It asks for a long reach on the part of the reader, and maybe we don't think that that is something that's designed for teenagers. Yes?
I was also saying the use of semicolons. My experience is that teenagers nowadays aren't comfortable with semicolons, and they don't know when to use them. They're not comfortable seeing them because I don't think they're used as much.
That sounds like a fabulous research question. What punctuation are teenagers today comfortable with and not comfortable with? I myself love a good semicolon. There's some definitely different uses of punctuation in this passage than we would consider in sort of traditional grammar, but it does give you something to think about, catches your eye if that's something that you're thinking about. Yeah.
I have taken a lot of writing classes, and they always say you want your first sentence to really grab the reader. And this language is rather abstract and descriptive. And I would think that you're going to lose your reader more than you're going to engage your reader. And with teenagers, I always want to grab them so that I don't lose them.
I think the entire genre of young adult literature feels compelled to grab those teenagers from the first cover look, from the title, from the first sentence, from the way the chapter is positioned. I think there is such a nice image. We want to grab those teenagers, and then YA doesn't want to let them go. So these are books that we consider to be page turners that you are going to start reading and really not be able to put down. That's the way that the young adult genre looks at its readers. And you might argue that this doesn't do that, or you may. One more.
I'm going to argue that that first paragraph would grab most of the teenage readers I know. But,
Yeah.
and I'm going to argue in favor of that teenagers aren't that scared of punctuation, the writers and the editors are. But anyway, that's my little bailiwick.
Okay, good.
But for me, it's the adult looking back, and while the first, I think whether we agree that the first paragraph would grab a teenage reader or not, I think the second paragraph would lose them.
I recall from sitting in my rocking chair, I look back over my life. So who do we expect the protagonist or the protagonists of a young adult novel or a teen-geared novel to be? Teenagers. Yeah. Okay, one more. Wow, you guys I should have just brought a whole bunch of these. This is fun. One. I wondered, what if? What if the football hadn't gone over the wall? What if Hector had never gone looking for it? What if he hadn't kept the dark secret to himself? What if? Then I suppose I would be telling myself another story. You see, the what ifs are as boundless as the stars. Quick partner discussion. See what you think about that. As you can see, it's the asking yourself why that's as productive or generative as the guessing portion of this. Show of hands, this was written for children. Show of hands, this was written for adults. Oh. Okay, so this is the opportunity if someone loves a good challenge, if you want to sit there and think of how this could be written for adults, now is an opportunity for you to do that. So the rest of you think that this is a novel written for teenagers, yes? Why? What are the features that call out young adult literature in this piece? Yeah.
Well, to your point about vampires, I'm picturing Hector got attacked by a vampire over the wall. That's how my kids think. So.
Okay. Huh.
Our kids are under 10.
No, they're 12. I mean, the dark secret, the whole thing. It's very.
Well, it gives you a lot to fill in, doesn't it? Who's Hector? Why are they going over the wall? What are the what ifs? A lot of blank spaces that you're presented with right at the start to start filling in. And that's a way to participate with your text. And teenagers do like that. Anything else about this that screamed out teenager to you? I'm looking in the back in case there's someone back there I haven't heard from yet. Teenagers? Yeah, go ahead. Yes, please.
This is a person who's at a stage in their life when they're thinking about their place in the world, how they fit in to the society, how the what ifs were.
Yeah. Main task of adolescence, how do I fit in? How do I stand apart? How do I fit in? And then this book has you thinking about that. Yes?
And this is something that would happen to them in that day or that week. So that's something very close to them.
We have some young people trappings. We've got football. We've got doing things you're not supposed to do. Why'd you go over the wall? Sounds like a boundary. Why are you crossing boundaries? Did you think about the consequences of your actions before you jumped in? Is that a good idea? Et cetera, et cetera. I want to share with you the 3 books. These are all books written for a young adult audience. Perhaps not an unexpected move on my part. But they bring different features to the genre. The first one is from a Terry Pratchett novel. Is anyone in here a Terry Pratchett reader? He writes for both, yay! He writes for both adults and young people. He has a huge opus of fantasy literature that he's written. He's constructed an entire imagined world called Discworld and written more than 30 novels about it. This is actually a step outside of that work that he does, and this is a retelling of Dickens from the point of view of Dodger. So this is taking literature that was intended for adults and claiming a part of it for the teenage audience. And then Dodger becomes the protagonist, and we see everything through his frame of mind. And where does Dodger hang out? In the sewers, of course. It's a fascinating, fabulous read. It tries to do two things at once. It tries to imitate and pay honor to Dickens' wonderful style, and it also tries to change it so that teenagers reading today recognize themselves in the character. So that's why it's a tricky choice right there. The middle piece was from a book called Octavian Nothing, written by M.T. Anderson, who's a very important author in the young adult literature world. It's part of a duet of books. This is the first one. And Octavian Nothing is a slave narrative. The main character is a teenage boy who is kept as a slave, and throughout before the Revolutionary War, so in the period leading up to the Revolutionary War, and throughout the trajectory of the novel, he looks for a way to acquire his freedom, which again is an interesting metaphor for adolescence, but this is a very, very, very serious, pointed, and difficult look at that. M.T. Anderson created the language of this novel in a way that he thought sounded like the language that was being spoken in the United States at the time, but he made it up. So it's a combination of slang and historical looking at the way people spoke. It's a fabulous read. It's a very difficult read. And then finally, we read the opening passage from Maggot Moon, which just last year was nominated for the Prince Award. And the main character is a teenage boy, a young teenage boy, living in a never-named USSR communist type country where he gets into a lot of trouble and tries to get out of it. Again, it's one of the best books I read last year. It is fabulous. The main character has two different colored eyes, and that becomes a symbol that follows him throughout.
Will you be giving us a bibliography?
I have a bibliography that I can email you, and I'll give you that information at the end, and I'll also send you to some places where you can read about some of these books that come out. So what is YA? We can go through this fairly quickly. It's a literature written for and about adolescents, first published as The Outsiders in 1967. It now occupies its own category on the New York Times bestseller list. Anyone know what got it there? Harry, of course. After a while, New York Times bestseller was like, it's a little frustrating to keep putting Harry Potter, Harry Potter, Harry Potter on the bestseller list, and it doesn't feel like it belongs in with those adult books. So we'll generate a new category for young adult literature. Well, they opened a whole floodgate when they did that, because right now young adult literature is the fastest growing in both profit and amount of literature in the United States publishing industry, which is interesting. It has its own awards, the National Book Awards, which will be announced in 2 weeks, I think, have a category for the literature of young people. And about 11 years ago, the American Library Association instituted the Prince Award for Best Young Adult Novel to come along with the Newbery Award for chapter books and the Caldecott Award for picture books. So just about 11 years ago, the American Library Association said, this genre seems to have arrived. Young adult literature is here and it's here to stay, and so let's find a way to recognize it and tell people about it. There's even an ambassador for young people's literature in the United States. That person is named by the Library of Congress for a 2-year term, and I'm waiting for them to ask me. They haven't done it yet, but maybe someday. And we'll talk about some of the people who serve in that capacity, and their job is to advocate for literacy and literature and pleasure reading among teenagers and youth in the United States. Pretty great idea, huh? And young adult literature has crossed over in so many ways. It's crossed over into being read by adults. So adults have sort of encroached on the YA term. It's crossed over into the movies and other forms of media, including video games and YouTube, social media interactions. It's read socially by teenagers, and it's read in multiple ways. A teenager might read their literature by listening to it as an audiobook. They might read it on an e-reader. They might read it in a hardback, softback. There's a million different ways right now that teenagers are reading. So YA is a multi-versed thing. Here are some of the genre features that I think are particular to young adult literature that explain why it sells so well and why it is so pleasurable for young adults to read, which explains why they keep reading it, which is one of the things we like about it. It focuses on the adolescent. It turns on this conflict between being independent and being dependent, which is the exact conflict that adolescents themselves are really working hard on. It surfaces the taboo and the subversive, so teenagers, when they pick up a young adult novel, have a close to guarantee that they're going to get to read about something that they're either not supposed to talk about or they don't feel comfortable talking about with adults. It gives them a chance to explore that in the pages. It is didactic. Young adult literature in the United States right now makes sure that it gives healthy messages to its teenagers. So you might be reading about a challenge, a subversive problem, or a taboo, but you're also going to be reading about a healthy way to resolve that. It makes voice paramount. So it's written usually in the first person, and teenagers have a really juicy way of speaking. They appreciate slang. They appreciate speaking in ways that adults can't understand, and that has traveled into the narration of the young adult novel. It features graphic and intertextual information. We see a lot of young adult literature is illustrated in some way. Not a full-blown picture book always, in the way that children's literature is, but of those books that we just did our quiz on, Maggot Moon actually is illustrated on each page all the way through. The illustrations are small and down in the corner of the pages so that you can actually treat it as a flip book. If you flip the pages really quickly, it doesn't work with what? A Kindle. So that's a problem. But you can read it as a flip book. You can read the text as a traditional novel. And the story that the pictures tell and the story that the words tell are not the same. So this is very, very complex, rigorous workout for the teen reader, and it means that you can then read the book over and over and over. And repeat reading is one feature that adolescents have brought to reading, and it's one thing that sometimes drives adults crazy. Are you reading that book again? And it's something that allows teenagers to go very, very deep into what they're reading, a really great cognitive workout for them. And I think it's interesting. I like this theme that I see running across young adult literature. It really advocates for the creative process. Many, many, many times we see in the young adult novel that the teenager finds a way to create something, and the novel resolves with them completing some kind of a project, having written something, having built something, having created a piece of art, having gone through the creative process and felt the challenge and the success of that. I'm happy to share slides with folks or give you more information at the end of the talk if there's information here that you like and you either don't feel like writing down this early in the morning or you can't see as clearly as you would like. Here are some reasons why adults don't like YA. They think it's too easy because it's short and it's simple, and I've heard them refer to it as lit light. Then why can't they just jump right in and read the real thing? Why do they need these kind of training wheels? But I think you've seen just from those first three passages that that might be a misunderstanding on our part as adults about what young adult literature brings. We worry that it furthers the stereotypes of adolescence, that we see teenagers who make bad choices, who speak in slangy ways, who are more concerned with the trappings of teenage life than they are with things that really matter. And we worry that teenagers reading these stereotypes will then feel like they are committed to repeating them. We worry that it's formulaic and predictable and sentimental, and that we know what's going to happen in a YA novel before we've even finished the book. That, I think, we've done a great job of changing. It is difficult to predict the end of a YA novel, and teenagers will tell me that that's what they like best in a read. If they can read all the way through and not predict what's going to happen, but they can still be satisfied by it. So surprised and satisfied at the same time. And then finally, we do worry that it is not rated G, and it's not even rated PG or PG-13. Sometimes YA is rated R. Sometimes the things I read in YA make me sit up a little bit. Oh, make me lose my microphone. So this notion that it is a little too strong, that it models bad practice and bad decision making, and that teenagers will read it as a kind of instruction manual. They're going to read a book about drinking too much and figure out how to be an alcoholic. They're going to read a book about unhealthy sexual behavior, and then they're going to have the manual right in front of them. This is a concern that a lot of adults have about young adult literature. Here are some reasons why maybe we want to reconsider our opinion. Teenagers who read YA are reading a lot. If you took the Harry Potter books 1 through 7 and added up how many pages a young person or a teenager had read by the time they completed that septology, you would be impressed, I hope, at how much reading they had done. Even if you took the Twilight series, which was a trilogy, a quadrilogy, a 4-book series, and is not looked upon with as much love and adoration and lasting power as Harry Potter, it was long. And once you started, if you went all the way through, you got a lot of pages under your belt. And guess what? There's one way to learn how to read and to get better at reading, and that's reading. So if young adult literature gets and keeps people reading, it has provided us with a very valuable service. Teens read YA socially. They pass books around. They talk to one another about what they read. They tell one another ways that they wish the book had been different or similar. And they go onto social media to rewrite the books, to rewrite chapters, to rewrite the ending. They are very social in the way that they read YA. And I believe that YA authors and publishers are very intentional about opening up the social aspect of reading, which I think is great. It extends multiple entrance points into the reading experience, and we've already talked about this. You can read in a traditional way, you can read in a non-traditional way. Even Kindle books number their pages differently than a regular book. So you can read the book in more than one format and have more than one reading experience with it, which is very fluid and exciting. YA offers teens a place of their own. It isn't for adults, and it's not for children. It's for them, and they can exist as the authorities in that world, and adults and children maybe need to come to them to find out more about what's going on in YA. One of my favorite memories of my daughter as a young teenager is playing her self-invented Harry Potter trivia game with my parents, her grandparents. For the life of me, I don't know why my parents were so good as to continue playing with her. She only ever asked questions that there was no way they would have been able to answer. She delighted in being the authority of Harry Potter, and they delighted in seeing her be that authority. She was the person who owned that realm, and that's one of the things that YA offers us. I believe that reading about difficult experiences allows teens to see consequence and resilience. I don't take the view of reading that it is an instruction manual for how to do bad things. And because a student or a teenager is interested in a difficult topic does not mean that they are planning on doing it. In fact, they might be reading it as a way to figure out how not to do it. So I don't think we want to bury those topics, and YA is a place for them to be examined. And it's fun. That's one of the goals of the genre, the people who write it and the people who publish it. They want reading to be pleasurable, and I believe they succeeded. And them succeeding at that means that teenagers are reading more often. Let's keep flying ahead. Oh, let's go back in time a little bit. Here I'd like to go back and forth between some of our prominent thinking about the developmental tasks of adolescents and some of the books that were published near or around that time that exemplify those things. And we didn't have YA or young adult literature before the turn of the century because we didn't really have adolescence before the turn of the century. Remember, we went from childhood to adulthood if you were lucky enough to live, and you went from being a child to being a working adult, and we didn't have the economic, social structure, or overall worldview to even make room for adolescence. But as we found a little more time, a little more health, and a little more money, there was room for adolescence. G. Stanley Hall wrote a 2-volume tome right at the turn of the century in 1904 called Adolescence, and that was the first time we saw that term come into being, where people were saying, oh, maybe that is a word for that thing that exists between childhood and adulthood. And in this, he promoted the idea that you haven't successfully completed adolescence until you've gone through some storm and stress, until you've gone through an angsty, difficult period and weathered it on the other side. He said that one of the main tasks of adolescence was to resolve your conflicts with parents. Thanks, G. Stanley Hall. So that idea stayed with us for a long time, that you weren't able to get out of adolescence until you had successfully had conflicts with your parents. Luckily, we've begun to rethink that a little bit. And he also said adolescence was a time to tame risky behaviors. We didn't have YA at the turn of the century, but does anyone want to think back to a best-selling series of books for young readers, many of whom were adolescent-ish, right at the turn of the century? Even the title. We didn't have the title teenager yet, so we had to make little adults. And that's somehow how we got to adolescence. And the main characters were the young people. I apologize for the resolution. Some of my slides didn't come out as sharp as I'd like them on this screen today. I'm not sure why that is. This series of books presented the idea that adolescents could handle tragedy and that they would actually grow and become stronger as a result of it. Right? There's a lot of artistic growth that happens in the Little Women, Little Men books, and it was a series. When young people read the first one, they returned to it so many times that they, in effect, as a group, said to the publishers, hey, give us more. And then they did, which was the first time that they sort of spoke back. There he is with his cigar. He brought up this idea that adolescence is a time to balance out the different forces within you, to go from this period of extremes to more balance. And then I took this wording directly from him, okay? To discharge tension and experience gratification. I couldn't resist. But this notion that you need to figure out a good way to have a good time and to feel confident with yourself, that is a task of adolescence that we've continued to think about. The book for young people that I paired with it is a whole, again, series of books. These are the colored fairy books. There was the blue fairy book, then the green fairy book. You don't need me to name the colors for you. These were compilations compiled by anthropologists who went around the world, not literally, but virtually, finding versions of fairy tales that had been around for a long time. But those fairy tales are interesting things for young readers. Actually, the protagonists of many of those are teenagers. They oftentimes end in marriage or this adult-like relationship between two people. And there's a lot of taboo in those original versions of the fairy tales. Do you remember how in the Grimm's version of Cinderella, the stepsisters fit into the glass slipper? They cut off parts of their feet. That seems unnecessary. And it also, these fairy tale books also introduce the idea of fantasy as a way to explore. There's Jean Piaget, who gave us some fascinating ideas about the way that young people's brains work, almost all of which he came to by doing research on his own 3 children. So he did small N research, as we call it, and he talked a lot about the teenager's ability to move from concrete to abstract thought, and I think you saw some evidence of that in the passages we were looking at earlier. And one of my favorites, as the parent of a wonderful teenager myself right now, it's time to decrease egocentric thought. Less thought about the self. You're ready, as you move towards adulthood, to think more about others. And then finally, this notion that you're going to draw and apply logic. Look who I paired with this. Speaking of drawing on logic, my girl Nancy, a very interesting contribution. She was actually, Nancy Drew's series was actually written for children. So we wrote books for children about a teenager. And Nancy Drew was the most adult teenager I've ever met. She was driving boats and cars and performing CPR and I don't know what all else. Her parents were an afterthought. Her mother was dead, and her father, I don't know what he was doing, but he wasn't parenting Nancy. And she brought with her teenage trappings. She had a car. She went to high school. She had a boyfriend who showed up, I don't know, when she needed a date to the prom. The rest of the time, Ned was just an afterthought. And she was a strong woman who solved mysteries through logic. There's Eric. I realize that we're seeing a lot of cigars and alcohol in the hands of these people. I'm sorry. So Erickson came up with important ideas about the task of adolescence that we still really constellate around today. He talked about how to develop a sense of your own identity as different from the people around you, similar to but different from. So this notion of the main task of adolescence is to individuate. I love the wording on this, that the idea of adolescence is to choose, excuse me again, problems with the microphone, to choose intimacy and trust or fidelity over isolation, to figure out the way to make relationships that help you, which is a beautiful and difficult task of adolescence. And a main thing that Erickson was focused on was adolescence is a time to figure out your roles into adulthood. I find that a lot of my much older adolescents here as undergraduates at Stanford are really still focused on that last one. I wonder if we haven't extended adolescence out. When we started, it was a pretty brief period of time, but with all of these tasks and all of these books to read, it seems like people need longer to resolve their period of adolescence. Here was a curious set of books that is still in print today. Did anyone enjoy these series of Teenager Takes on a Profession books? Sue Barton, school nurse, went on to be School Barton camp nurse, School Barton army nurse, School Barton hospital nurse. So a series again. These books are strongly moralistic and didactic beyond a point that I find super enjoyable today. But these books showed young people taking on a job and embracing it and forming their identity through the job. We also had series about journalists, pilots, lawyers, nurses, and teachers. And in some cases, they were both for both boys and girls, so some nice cross-gender thinking there. And you can still find Sue Barton in print today, nursing her way. She goes on to be a nursing supervisor, by the way, in case you were concerned. Here's a controversial person, Bruno Bettelheim. His work has been questioned from a number of standpoints, but he did win the Pulitzer for his book, The Uses of Enchantment, that looks at how young readers use fairy tales specifically. And he said that one of the tasks of adolescence was to be able to see ourselves in the myths that we share with one another. And also to be able to see that fairy tales are a way to surface our fears from our unconscious and take a hold of those and take some kind of command of them, which is an interesting idea. He was very against the Disneyfication of fairy tales. He said, when you replace the chopping off of the feet parts with silly bit of physical humor about tripping over a shoe, that you've denied young people the ability to really explore what they're scared of. Thank you, Caroline. Hey, there's an important book for young readers, and a one in which Tolkien really encourages us to see ourselves in these mythic figures. Also gives us the battle of good and evil. Tolkien wrote The Hobbit for his grandchildren, telling them the story at night. Then he went on to write the trilogy Lord of the Rings for adults. So somewhere in there are teenagers who today still love reading Lord of the Rings. Superman. There's so much I can say about Superman, but here's what I'll say about him today. He was cheap and fast. And here's what happened. Teenagers could go to the corner newsstand with a couple of pennies, and they could make their own choice about what they were going to buy. And what they bought told the publishers, here's what we want more of. And what they didn't buy did the opposite. So here's Superman is a place where they took control of that YA market. Now we're going to pick up speed. Everybody with me? Richard Wolbe looked at attachment theory and said one of the goals of the teenage years is to figure out strong and healthy attachments and to figure out how to use the people around you to make your life better. 17th Summer was originally written for women. And they thought if we give you a nostalgic tale about what your first young love was like in your 17th year, that you will be transported back in nostalgic euphoria. Women didn't read it so much. Teenage girls were all over it. And then we saw the way paved to the romance, where there's a lot of interest right now in young adult literature. Show of hands, people who read Fault in Our Stars or saw the movie. So this was its grandparent. There's our guy. Written for adults. I'm pretty sure that J.D. Salinger would have been highly offended to hear his book referred to as young adult literature, but he gave us Holden. And Holden became this consummate first-person teenager with a really tony voice and an ambiguous ending. Things don't work out perfectly for Holden. We still leave him in the hospital, right? So it isn't this neatly tied up happy ending package. And now we're going to fly. Sperry did split brain research. You've got a left brain and a right brain, not just one brain, and it's your job to be in control of both of them. There's the outsiders, where you need to control the emotional side of yourself with the physical side of yourself, with the intellectual side of yourself. At the end of The Outsiders, the main character has written his entire own autobiography. So he has intellectualized his experience, and you're reading a book within a book. Here's Bill Damon. He's a scholar here on campus. He looks at the idea of moral development. And he says, hey, guess what, teenagers? As long as you're busy with everything else, you also need to be developing morally and civically. Really interesting idea. Harry believes in moral development. I'm flying now. Amado Padilla, one of my colleagues in the School of Education, talks about the tasks of resilience, understanding how to exhibit resilience in the face of difficulty and making the teenager responsible for doing that. Really interesting idea. Hunger Games. Yeah. Lynn Wolf works in San Francisco. She's written an incredible book called The Romance of Risk. I recommend if you have teenagers, you buy a copy and just leave it lying around the house. It'll get snapped up like that. She looks at cases of teenagers who are learning how to manage risk. Any young adult literature coming to mind with this idea? This is the first novel to win the Prince Award. So the first one that was awarded for being best teen novel. In this novel, the protagonist is in jail awaiting trial for a crime that we don't know if he's committed or not. And you don't know at the end of the novel either. You go through the whole trial, and it's up to you as the reader to decide. Very, very interesting approach. Here's our former Surgeon General, and she was responsible in saying, in addition to all these other tasks, we also want teenagers to work on their own health. Huh. Flying still. Fault in Our Stars. Health becomes a metaphor for adolescent development. Carol Dweck's work on mindset, I'm sure you're very, very familiar with her work that says you are responsible for learning how to take a challenge and make the most of it. This was the second book to win the award for Best Young Adult Novel. It's a novel told in verse. And this is a young woman who is in difficult circumstances, and by the end, she gets herself out of those difficult circumstances. And she does it because she has a mother who is not dead, like in most young adult novels, and is not foolish or stupid or self-absorbed, but who is a strong, interesting, caring character. So now we have parents who are fully formed characters in young adult literature. We have reached the end of our time today. And we didn't even talk about all the great research, which I'm happy to talk about. And we didn't even talk about the books that I want to recommend to you. I'm happy to share this information with you. I'm going to fly through this one slide about the kind of research we're doing in young adult literature and cognition. And if you want to stay for that, I encourage you to. And if not, we'll get this information to you. So it is interesting to me that young adult literature is housed in our education library, and it's also housed in our law library. And I don't know, and I've asked, I don't know why. And guess what? It gets checked out all the time. And the only people who can really use the law library with ease are law students. So somebody is reading for pleasure when they are supposed to be doing their homework. I get to teach a class in the young adult novel. It's a great joy to teach it to undergraduates. And their final project in that class is to design a pleasure reading intervention for a group of adolescents. And I would love at some time to talk to you about the wonderful interventions they've designed and then they execute over the summer and then come back and tell us about the results of that. The Center for the Study of Excellence in Teaching here at Stanford teaches classes in literacy, adolescent literacy, and the young adult novel to practicing teachers who come here in the summertime to improve their practice. I get to teach those. They are a delight. The Stanford Book Salon, from time to time, will read a young adult novel. I was able to be the faculty host the year that we looked at the Hunger Games, and I was not prepared for, first of all, it's more response than they've ever gotten in a literary salon, and not everybody loved it like I did. And some people refused to read. They wanted to participate in the salon, but they didn't want to read the book because they were worried that it was violent and sent negative messages. So we had a fabulous conversation online that went on and on and on and on. The Stanford Bookstore includes YA titles that are written by Stanford graduates, and it also includes YA novels that contain Stanford as some kind of a character or plot device. So that is enjoyable and interesting. We have two places who are currently doing neuroimage research on adolescent reading. It's completely fascinating. One study shows that when you put someone who is reading into an MRI, so we want to give a big shout out of thanks to the people who have been willing to participate in this research, because to lie in an MRI with that huge thumping sound while you're reading is quite an act. We thought that the area of the brain that controls language would light up. But what we're finding is the topic that the person is reading about, whether that's running or fear or eating or love, that's the part of the brain that also lights up as they're reading. So this lays the groundwork for us to understand that reading is a great workout cognitively on a number of levels. You're truly entering into story when you're reading in this way, and I would argue that young adult literature really invites that kind of deep entrance in. And then finally, my colleague, Dr. Landy, is talking about how, in his humanities science project, is talking about how the reading of literature is good for something beyond reading literature. How there are particular skills in argument, in conflict resolution, and in establishing relationships that the reading of literature itself strengthens. Again, why we love to see people reading young adult literature. As is obvious, I could talk about this for a long time. It is a delight to be able to talk to you about it this morning, and if you would like to hear about some YA books that I think are really terrific and that my undergraduates nominated as best reads, please come on up and I would love to talk to you about that. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day today. Thank you.